Jaredites in the Book of Mormon claim to come from the Tower of Babel, or the Great Tower. At the time, the Lord confounded the tongues, the languages of the people. Critics state that if the Tower of Babel is a myth, then the Jaredite story is built off a myth and it isn't real history, as well as the 16 stones touched by the finger of the Lord. If they're not real, then the 2 stones or interpreters that were buried with the gold plates aren't real either, calling into question the Book of Mormon historicity and Joseph Smith's claim of the bringing forth of the Book of Mormon. Mormonism with the Mirth, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hi everyone, this is a corrected version of my first video. I did get some pushback and some complaints that I didn't share enough maybe scholarly writings on this topic, and that was perhaps fault of mine. So this is a slight edited version where I include some other apologetic responses with regards to the Tower of Babel issue. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So we're continuing our series on the Book of Mormon. In the last episode, we had a look at Deutero-Isaiah, and that Bible scholars believe that there are multiple authors of Isaiah. The chapters 40 to 55 is a second author of Isaiah, and 55 to 66 is a third author of Isaiah. And that the Deutero-Isaiah was written, the scholarly consensus is after the Jewish exile, after the Babylonian captivity, and that Lehi and his family wouldn't have had access to those Deutero-Isaiah passages on the brass plates because they weren't written until years after. And this being a problem, why is Deutero-Isaiah passages being quoted in the Book of Mormon? Is this a textual anachronism? We had a look at some of the scholarship, what critics have to say, what apologists have to say. Go back and watch that one. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at biblical scholarship and the criticisms and apologetics surrounding the Tower of Babel. It's believed to be a myth, not literal history, by scholars, and the Jaredites come from the Tower of Babel, it is believed. And does this pose problems for the Jaredite narrative, the Book of Ether, and the Book of Mormon's historicity as a whole? So we're going to be diving into that today, and I've got some slides prepared, so let's dive in. So this comes from LDS Discussions, and a lot of this, again, I'm not an expert on this, I'm not a Bible scholar, but I'm going to try to present the arguments and the evidence for it. And if anyone knows of any good scholarly apologetic responses, specifically to the impact the Tower of Babel has on the Jaredites, I couldn't find a whole lot in my research, but I'm going to present what I have found. So LDS Discussion says the Tower of Babel is the famous story in Genesis 11 that explains why different civilizations and communities in the ancient world spoke different languages. So this was after the flood, Noah and the flood. And there is, a community of people, and they're all speaking the one language. And this is where, the Adamic language comes from. And this is the explanation for all the different languages. The Tower of Babel story is estimated to have happened, depending on the source, around 2400 to 2200 BCE, about 100 years after the global flood would have occurred. This story is considered by most biblical scholars and pretty much all secular scholars to be an etiological myth, or an origin myth, which is a mythical story to explain the origin of differing languages. Moreover, the Tower of Babel story is similar to other myths all over the world to explain the confounding of languages, and the Genesis account is likely heavily influenced by Sumerian and Assyrian myths. And scholars, linguistic scholars, will reject this because languages have been around for thousands of years before this, and that this is an explanation for all the different languages that we have in the world. The Book of Mormon requires that the Tower of Babel be a historical event, as it ties directly into not just the Jaredites coming to the Americas, but to their records in the Book of Ether, the Nephite interpreters, and the truth claims of the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith as well. So even though this is considered to be a myth, an etiological myth, it's tied in the Book of Mormon to the historical Jaredites coming from the Tower of Babel, and also it talks about in the Book of Ether, the 24 Jaredite plates, and the stones that the Lord sort of lit with his finger, which I believe become the Nephite interpreters. I may be wrong on that, if anyone can correct me, and that this is problematic for those tangible truth claims for the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith, as he claimed the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. So let's go to the next slide. So Michael Ash, this is what he has to say on the Tower of Babel, if it's historical or mythological. He said, last week I began discussing the Jaredites and the Tower of Babel and how the story might be reconciled for those who believe that science and religion do not necessarily conflict. Some people, for instance, believe that the story of the Tower of Babel falls into the realm of fantasy rather than history. There are historical indicators, however, that suggest the story is a myth in the scholarly sense. I think the church's position, like I would have grown up very orthodox and fundamentalist, and would have believed in, literal global flood and the Tower of Babel, that this is a real historical event, and the scholarly consensus is pretty much saying that this is a myth. While most people think of myths as fables, which is what the word actually means, scholars loosely define myths as culturally shared narratives that bind, inspire, or help delineate a particular culture. In the academic world, the word myth is detached from popular associations with falsehood. They equate to legends, which may or may not be based on actual truths. Myths are often pre-scientific stories used to explain why things are as they are. They may represent types or models, or if they exaggerate a real event, they may conflate multiple events into a single story. And they typically make erroneous assumptions based on an incomplete understanding of actual facts. He's kind of trying to soften, that myth means like falsehood, but it is sort of as he put it, it's sort of like a legend that cultures would be telling these narratives as a way to bind people. But is it historically, scientifically true? And I think the scholarly consensus would be no. So when was the Tower of Babel in the Pentateuch? So this comes from LDS discussions. While Genesis was long believed to have been written by Moses himself during his lifetime, estimated to be 1391 to 1271 BCE, most biblical scholars now agree that the Pentateuch was not compiled until much later. Many scholars now believe that Genesis was not compiled until the 6th, and more likely the 5th century BCE. As mentioned above, the Tower of Babel is very similar to other etiological myths from other cultures. A Sumerian myth written about 2100 BCE, called Emrakar and the Lord of Rada, discusses calling upon the Lord to unite the languages again among the people. And an Assyrian myth dating from the 8th century BCE discussed the confounding of tongues. Last, as former CS instructor and Bible scholar David Bockfoy pointed out, the Tower of Babel story is a Babylonian polemic against ziggurat worship, which I believe like these towers they would build and try to climb on. This makes sense given that scholars have believed that the Entemanke, a ziggurat dedicated to Marduk in the city of Babylon, likely influenced the Tower of Babel story. So they're arguing that the Tower of Babel, that's in the book of Genesis. There's maybe some controversy, but I think the consensus of most Bible scholars is that it wasn't compiled until maybe around the 6th century BCE, and that there are Assyrian myths and also Babylonian polemics about ziggurat worship, which probably influenced the Tower of Babel story and narrative, and it might have come from those myths and didn't originate with the Old Testament, which we're going to look at some of the implications now to the Jaredites. So LDS discussion says, many biblical scholars, almost every secular scholar, and every linguistic expert agrees that the Tower of Babel story is an etiological myth that was written to explain why there were different languages. For many religions, this is a problem, but one that can be addressed by focusing on the lesson of pride while acknowledging that the story itself was not historical, because they were trying to build a tower to get to heaven. For the Book of Mormon, however, the Tower of Babel presents a much greater problem. In the Book of Ether, there is a literal recounting of the Tower of Babel. However, I know the name of the tower being the Tower of Babel isn't in the Book of Mormon, but this comes from the first chapter of Ether. So it's an abridgment taken from the Book of Ether also. This is actually from the title page, which is a record of the people of Jared who were scattered at the time the Lord confounded the language of the people, and they were building a tower to get to heaven. Ether 1 verse 33, which Jared came forth with his brother and their families, with some others and their families from the great tower at the time the Lord confounded the language of the people, and swore in his wrath that they should be scattered upon all the face of the earth. And according to the word of the Lord, the people were scattered. And the brother Jared, being a large and mighty man, and a man highly favored of the Lord, Jared his brother said unto him, cry unto the Lord that he will not confound us, that we may not understand our words. And it came to pass that the brother of Jared did cry unto the Lord, and the Lord had compassion upon Jared. Therefore he did not confound the language of Jared, and Jared and his brother were not confounded. So the author LDS discussion says, it is clear from the Book of Mormon that the Tower of Babel must be a literal historical event, if the Book of Mormon is a true historical record. Jared comes directly from the Tower of Babel, and God then leads them to the Americas with the original Adamic language intact and not confounded. And it does say that it was at the time that the Lord confounded the language of the people. So Jared and his brother were there at the time, so not after. So that this wouldn't have been a myth that they would have just carried with them, but the confounding of the languages and their scattering happened when they were there at the time. So if the Tower of Babel is a mythical event, as the evidence tells us, then Jared's story immediately becomes non-historical. But it gets even more problematic than just the Jaredite story, because if the Tower of Babel did not happen, then the 16 stones that the Lord touched were non-historical, which means that the 2 stones sealed up to translate the plates of Jared and the Book of Ether were also non-historical. Those same stones were later used as Nephite interpreters, which were buried with the gold plates of the Book of Mormon. If the Tower of Babel was mythical, as both history and linguistics tell us, then the Nephite interpreters are also mythical because they rely on a literal Tower of Babel. And so those are maybe some of the implications and the conclusions critics would draw if the Tower of Babel is not historical, according to scholars and linguistic experts. If it's an origin myth story that came from, the Babylonians or Assyrian myth, then this has implications. Well, were the Jaredites, were they historical because they claimed to come from the Tower of Babel? And the 16 stones that were touched by the finger of the Lord, which 2 stones later become the interpreters used to translate the plates of ether and that were buried with the gold plates. And it does call into question the historicity of the Jaredites and ether and even the Book of Mormon. So this does pose as a problem for Book of Mormon historicity. So the critics' conclusion: we can approach the Tower of Babel from multiple areas of study to know that it is not a historical event. The diversity of language began long before the Tower of Babel would have occurred, making clear that the story is simply not historical. And I think faithful scholars would agree with that as well. Furthermore, Genesis 10 contradicts the idea of a single Adamic language, and we can see that the Tower of Babel story is heavily influenced by other origin myths that sought to explain why there is a diversity of languages. This is a problem for all religions that view Genesis as scripture, but most religions can accept the Tower of Babel as a myth and focus on the lessons it offers. However, because the Book of Mormon builds the Jaredite story from the Tower of Babel, it is impossible to reconcile the historicity of the Book of Mormon with a mythical Tower of Babel. To be clear, the Book of Mormon states that the Jaredites come from the Tower of Babel and are only able to maintain the original Adamic language after pleading with God. And yeah, it does talk about that in the verses in Ether 1. Furthermore, they come from the Valley of Nimrod, which is a nod to the Bible, and they use similar language in their account to Genesis. And he's probably arguing that Joseph Smith, as the author, wouldn't have known that the Tower of Babel is a myth, and that he is drawing upon the accounts in Genesis talking about the Jaredites and their history. The only reason that some apologists would now want to allow for the possibility that there is a second tower is because the Tower of Babel story is clearly not historical. We have seen this kind of rewriting of church scriptures and teachings on Adam and Eve and the Great Flood as well, but this is a change in teaching that only comes from a position of weakness, as the evidence no longer supports the church's core truth claims. The Book of Mormon tells us that the Jaredite story comes from 24 plates of records that were translated with Nephite interpreters that were touched by the Lord following the Tower of Babel, and those same interpreters were claimed by Joseph Smith to be with the gold plates of the Book of Mormon. If the Tower of Babel is a myth, as the evidence tells us, then every story that comes from it cannot be historical. So Ben Spackman, who is a scholar on scripture and understanding both science and religion, he's been on different podcasts such as Fair Mormon conferences and Saints Unscripted. I'll maybe cite some of the videos in the description where he talks about maybe moving away from a fundamentalist view of scripture and understanding scripture and the context it was written in. And this is what he has to say on benspackman.com, where he engages a lot with both scripture and science and history. And this is what he has to say. We need to remember something simple but important. Although Moroni is separated by almost 1,000 years from Ether, and Ether is separated from the brother of Jared by a similar distance, all of these are ancient peoples, though inspired, express themselves through ancient cultural patterns, with ancient knowledge and assumptions. The first issue That is, Ether, I think, the most heavily edited and translated book we have. Records of some kind are kept by the Jaredites, and centuries later, edited and compiled by Ether. These plates are then translated or edited by Mosiah. 500 years later, they are re-edited by Moroni, who makes expansive and editorializing commentary, and then they are translated again by Joseph Smith. So although it appears we are reading an immediate first-hand eyewitness account of a tar and language change, in actuality, that record passed through lots of minds in editing, whom we know inserted their own comments to the record. There's lots of room for ancient interpolation here. So that he's saying that the Book of Ether, the record of the Jaredites, it was written by Ether, then translated by Mosiah, and then you have 500 years later after that Moroni redacting and editing as well. So we don't know who to attribute the myth of the tar to, whether it was Ether, whether it was Mosiah in his translation, Moroni, and then obviously it was translated by Joseph Smith as well. And perhaps that this could have been a myth descended down by the Jaredites as well themselves, of an origin myth of where they came from. He also says, note that Ether never refers to Babel, but only the tar and the great tar. Mesopotamia certainly had tars and great tars in the form of ziggurats. Genesis shows strong Mesopotamian influence in the short Tower Babel story, and is probably using Mesopotamian traditions to argue against and ridicule Babylon as a source of confusion, not education and high culture. So it never refers to, in Ether, to the Tower of Babel, only the Great Tower, and that this could have been perhaps, maybe they came from Mesopotamia, and the Great Towers that they are building there, the ziggurats, and it may not be referring to the Tower of Babel, and perhaps that is our assumption or our reading of the text, that we as Latter-day Saints believed, oh, they must have came from the Tower of Babel. So that's Ben Spackman's view on it, and I'll leave his article in the description where you can read more about that. I couldn't find many apologetic scholarly articles, nothing on Fair, Book of Mormon Central responding specifically to this. We have the quote from Michael Ash. I did ask some questions to Brent Gardner, Stephen Smoot, and Blake Ostler about it, and Patrick Mason also when he was interviewed on Mormon Stories. So I've pretty much just done brief sort of bullet points of what their response is. Brent Gardner talks about how it was information that Moroni got from Mosiah, who translated the Jaredite Plates, and that Moroni is summarizing what others previously thought, and that that's two translations away from the original. So that is you could say, the translation that Mosiah did of the Jaredite Plates. Perhaps they believed in this myth that that's where the Jaredites came from. That is one possible apologetic as well. Stephen Smoot said that Moroni is saying this in Ether, that he's the editor and redactor of the Jaredite record that was brought to him. Moroni has a tradition of the Tower of Babel and makes the connections to the Jaredites. The Tower of Babel not explicitly mentioned, but the Great Tower. The Tower of Babel is a mythical story, and you have Joseph's translation of Moroni's abridgment, of Mosiah's translation of Ether's abridgment of the Jaredites, and that there could be transmission errors possible. It does allow you to have to stretch a little bit to believe that, okay, well, maybe this is Moroni redacting in his abridgment of the gold plates, and this is a translation of, Mosiah that he did on the plates of Ether, and perhaps this is Moroni or Mosiah inserting this in. Blake Oster said that, the Tower of Babel, it is a myth. It's not an explanation for all of the languages that we have on Earth. Ether isn't from the Tower of Babel. The myth represents their mythic origin story, although it did say that Jared and the brother of Jared, they were there at the time of the confounding of languages when they were building a tower. So they're claiming that they were historically present when that was happening. He says that this supports it being an ancient text. The Book of Jared is a dynastic history of a myth. So them having that myth supports it being historical, because all sort of ancient texts would have had these origin myth stories. Although I think one of the problems would be is that Jared and his brother claim to be there at the time of the confounding of languages, not that they descend and have this origin, myth story. Patrick Mason, he said how the first 9 chapters of Genesis aren't literal history. and that the Book of Ether could be like a midrash or commentary on the Bible. Ether is engaging with the Tower of Babel story and building the Jaredite story upon a story. Mormon could be redacting the Jaredite record. It's a founding origin myth, and Mormon in his redaction is interacting with the Jaredite Plates. So he's possibly the one adding in the commentary, adding in sort of like this myth story of where the Jaredites came from. If there's any more apologetic answers or scholarship, I would be very interested to see it. So conclusion slide. So the Tower of Babel is considered to be an etiological myth and not literal history by both biblical and linguistic scholars. The Jaredites in the Book of Mormon claim to come from the Great Tower, which has been understood to be the Tower of Babel. Critics state that if the Tower of Babel is a myth, then the Jaredite story is built off a myth and isn't real history. And then the 16 stones that were touched by the finger of the Lord if they aren't real, and then the 2 stones, which later become the interpreters, which were buried with the gold plates, aren't real. This calls into question Book of Mormon history and Joseph Smith's claims for the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. The Tower of Babel was considered probably to Joseph Smith, as most fundamentalist Protestants believed in the 19th century, that this was all literal history, the global flood, and that this is evidence that he is the author, not understanding that the Tower of Babel and the global flood isn't real history. So apologists would believe that the myth or the belief that the Jaredites came from the Tower of Babel or the Great Tower might have come from either Ether's record or Mosiah's translation of Ether's record, and if this was later redacted and edited by Moroni. So the myth may have come from Ether or Moroni attaching an origin myth to the Jaredites. This could have been myth or tales told by the descendants of the Jaredites or Moroni in his redaction and editing, attributing it to the Jaredites. Apologists say that the Book of Mormon refers to the Great Tower and not the Tower of Babel, implying that they could have come from perhaps Mesopotamia, ziggurat tradition, and not the Tower of Babel as we assumed. But I'll let you draw your own conclusion, which you find the stronger argument as well. But do more research on the topic. I'll include links in the description if you want to read up more. So that kind of sums up today's episode, and you sort of come to your own conclusions on the way that you see it. We're going to be looking at, in the next episode, 19th century Protestant Christianity. In the Book of Mormon, we're going to be looking at maybe some of the sermons or some of the conversion experiences and how they're maybe similar to 19th century revival preachers or people having their own conversion experiences. And is this just a 19th century Protestant book? We're going to be looking at, again, some of the work of Grant Palmer in his book, Insider's View of Mormon Origins, and looking at some of the apologetic responses as well. But hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. I would really appreciate if you share this content with people. I'm trying to grow my channel to get more followers and people aware of this content. I really appreciate a like, a share, a comment, so that more people can see it, and that would really help me out. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.